The encounter at the palace gates. Logan stood stoically at his post, a man of discipline and unwavering loyalty to his duty. The sun, just beginning to dip below the horizon, painted the sky in hues of gold and purple. The royal palace behind him stood tall and majestic, its stone walls weathered by time but still exuding a sense of power and history. His uniform, pristine and perfectly tailored, glinted in the fading light, and his mind was sharp with focus. This was his life, his purpose. As one of the royal guards, he had learned to block out distractions, to become a fixture in the background, unnoticed and unshaken by the world around him. But today was different. It started with the faint sound of movement. Logan's trained eyes shifted subtly to the side. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the small figure. A baby, no older than 8 months, crawling slowly toward him on the cobblestone pathway. The child's skin was streaked with dirt and grime, but it was the eyes that caught Logan's attention, one blue, the other brown, an odd but striking contrast that seemed to shimmer in the late afternoon sun. The baby's little hands scraped the stone, tiny fingers desperately searching for purchase, but the effort was weak, as though the child lacked the strength to push itself forward. Logan's instincts flared. He saw the desperation in the baby's eyes, felt an unspoken pull that tugged at his very soul. But his duty called louder. He had been trained to remain unmoved, to show no emotion in the face of any distraction. He had seen his fellow guards ignore countless other distractions, beggars, children, tourists, anything that wasn't the royal family or their direct orders. But this was different. There was a stillness in the air as the baby, trembling, made its way closer. Logan's heart hammered against his ribs, his chest tightening as he watched the child's frailty. His mind screamed at him to stay put, to maintain his composure, to adhere to the rules that had governed his life for so long. Yet, something about the child's pitiful condition gnawed at him. The baby's breaths were shallow, its body trembling with the weakness of starvation or illness. Logan's gaze flickered between the baby and the palace gates. His loyalty to the kingdom and the rules of his post warred with a deep, gut-wrenching need to protect this helpless child. The child, clearly exhausted, collapsed a short distance away. Its tiny body fell limp onto the stone, the life seemingly draining from it in slow, agonizing breaths. Logan's body surged with action before his mind could even catch up. Without a moment's hesitation, he broke his stance. His armor clanked as he rushed forward, sweeping the fragile child into his arms with startling gentleness. The baby's small, hollow chest pressed against his own, the warmth of its fragile body reminding him of his humanity, of something greater than duty. The baby whimpered, a weak cry barely escaping its parched lips, and Logan felt his resolve crumble. He had never known a moment of weakness like this before. He didn't know how long he stood there, frozen, cradling the baby in his arms, feeling the soft rise and fall of its chest beneath the weight of his hands. His training had failed him. He should have returned the child to the palace staff. He should have called for help. But none of that mattered now. His eyes locked on the baby's face, and for a brief moment, he saw his own reflection in the child's mismatched eyes. A connection was made, something beyond the realms of logic, beyond the structure of rank and duty. It was pure, simple, and real. The decision was made in an instant. With the baby still limp in his arms, Logan began to run. His legs moved with a fluidity he hadn't thought possible, his focus entirely on the small, fragile life in his arms. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears, but it was the sound of the child's irregular breathing that spurred him forward. He couldn't let it die. Not like this. Not alone. His mind screamed at him to return to his post, to follow protocol, but his heart drowned out the voice of reason. He had made his choice, and nothing else mattered. The Palace Hospital, a grand building nestled within the royal grounds, came into view just as Logan's legs began to burn with exhaustion. The staff moved swiftly as he arrived, recognizing the urgency in his actions. He couldn't afford to wait for anyone to question him or hold him accountable for his actions. The child's life was at stake. He handed the baby over to the medical team, his hands trembling as he let go of the tiny form that had become his responsibility. Time seemed to stretch and twist as the doctors worked tirelessly. Logan paced the room, the walls closing in on him as he waited for any sign of good news. He couldn't shake the image of the baby's face, pale, fragile, so close to death. The minutes felt like hours, but finally, a doctor emerged from behind the hospital curtains. His face was grim but hopeful. "It's a miracle he's alive," the doctor said, a note of relief in his voice. "He's severely malnourished and dehydrated, but with proper care, he'll recover." Logan's breath hitched in his chest. He had done it. The child was going to live. But his relief was short-lived. As soon as the news was delivered, Logan was escorted out of the hospital and directed toward the palace office. The weight of the world settled on his shoulders. His mind swirled with the consequences of his actions. He had broken the rules, abandoned his post. He could feel the eyes of the palace staff on him as he walked with an uncertain, reluctant step. Inside, the captain was waiting. The air in the room was thick with the expectation of reprimand. Logan stood tall, despite the tightening in his chest. He would face whatever came next, no matter the consequences. "Logan," the captain's voice dripped with disdain, "you abandoned your post for an orphan. For a child who isn't even royalty." Logan's heart sank as the captain's words sliced through him. It wasn't the first time his race had been used against him. He had long learned to ignore the whispers, the side glances, the judgment that came with being a black man in a position of such high status. But this was different. The captain's words were sharp, cutting through everything Logan had worked for. He stood there, his jaw clenched, but he refused to let the venom of the captain's words break him. "You're dismissed," the captain said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're no longer fit to serve. You've lost your post, and there's nothing I can do to change that." The words were final. Logan turned away, the sting of failure gnawing at him. But something deeper lingered, a feeling of loss not for the job he had given up, but for the unknown future of the child he had saved. Logan's departure from the palace was quieter than he expected. The weight of the captain's words followed him as he walked out into the cool evening air. His mind buzzed with uncertainty, but there was one thing he was sure of: the child, Thomas, had to be taken care of. He couldn't leave him behind, not after everything he had been through. The decision had already been made. Logan couldn't go back. As Logan returned home, his wife, Mila, waited for him. Her eyes were sharp, her brow furrowed with anger. She didn't speak, but her gaze said everything. When Logan explained what had happened, the silence between them grew heavy. Mila's lips tightened into a thin line, and when she finally spoke, her words were cold. "Because of him, you lost your job, Logan. Everything's ruined," she said. "You're not even thinking about the consequences of your actions." Logan sighed, feeling the weight of his wife's disappointment. But his resolve didn't falter. "We're not leaving him," Logan said, his voice firm. "He has no one else." Mila shook her head, disbelief flashing across her face. "You're choosing him over us?" Logan's heart tightened. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew that Thomas, this child, needed him, needed love and care, something that had been denied to him for so long. No matter the cost, Logan would make sure Thomas was loved, cared for, and never abandoned again. As Logan's words settled into the silence, Mila's anger faded into something more complicated: resignation, perhaps, or perhaps a flicker of hope that Logan's decision would somehow improve their lives. But at that moment, she couldn't see the possibility of anything beyond their struggles. Thomas, the frail baby Logan had saved, would become part of their world, a part of their family. Little did they know, this decision would change all of their lives in ways they never anticipated. The journey was just beginning. A strained home. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, as Logan tried to navigate the new reality of his life with Thomas. His heart swelled with a quiet joy at the sight of the boy's small victories, the way Thomas slowly learned to walk, the way he began to mimic Logan's voice when he tried to speak. But despite these precious moments, the atmosphere at home had shifted, and the weight of the unspoken tension between Logan and Mila grew heavier with each passing day. Mila, her anger still simmering beneath the surface, kept her distance from Thomas. It wasn't just that she resented the child's presence, it was something deeper, something more personal. She had never fully accepted Thomas into their family. She had tried, at first, to look after him, but her efforts were half-hearted at best. She fed him, clothed him, and gave him shelter, but her love remained cold, distant. It was as though she had placed an invisible barrier between herself and the child, a wall that neither time nor circumstance seemed able to break. Logan could see it clearly. Every day, as he returned home from his work, whether it was guarding the palace or running errands, Mila's eyes would shift uncomfortably whenever she saw Thomas clinging to him. The sight of Logan showering the boy with affection, teaching him new words, and playing games, seemed to prick at something inside her. But rather than confront the emotions stirring within her, Mila chose to bury them under layers of bitterness and frustration. As the days passed, Logan noticed the subtle signs of the strain building between him and Mila. When he asked her to spend time with Thomas, to engage with the boy, she would turn away, offering a cold excuse. "I've got too much to do," she would say, her voice tight, her face unreadable. Sometimes, she would leave the house altogether, leaving Logan to care for Thomas alone. The emotional distance grew. The few conversations they had became strained and distant, their once shared hopes for a better life falling apart in the face of growing resentment. Logan could feel the sharpness of Mila's discontent every time she spoke, every time she looked at him, her eyes no longer filled with the warmth they once held. Her voice had begun to drip with accusations, blaming Thomas for every misstep they had made, every hardship they faced. "It's all your fault," Mila would snap, her anger bubbling to the surface with surprising ferocity. "You chose him over your job. Now we're barely getting by. We were fine before you brought him here. He's nothing but a burden." The words stung, each one cutting deeper than the last. Logan would try to counter her anger, to explain that he couldn't just leave Thomas, that the boy needed them, that he was already a part of their family. But Mila would only sneer at him, her lips curling in disgust. "You think he's a part of this family?" she would ask. "Look at him, Logan. He's not ours. He's not your son. He's nothing but an orphan, and now we're stuck with him." Logan's heart would break at the words, but he wouldn't back down. He had promised Thomas he would always be there for him, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter what it cost him. But the cost of that promise became clearer every day. The frustration and the anger in Mila's voice weren't the only things weighing on Logan's mind. It was the silence. The absence of warmth in their home, the coldness that lingered in the air whenever Mila was around. It was the way Thomas seemed to shrink a little more every day, the way his laughter dimmed in the presence of Mila's harsh words. Logan would come home to find the boy huddled in a corner, his mismatched eyes wide with uncertainty, as if he had somehow absorbed the tension of the house. Despite the strained atmosphere, Logan refused to let go of the love he had for Thomas. He poured every ounce of his affection into the boy, teaching him new things, showing him the world outside their home, helping him to explore and discover. But no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much love he gave, there was always that flicker of doubt in Thomas's eyes, the fear of being unwanted, unloved. Logan could see it, and it tore him apart. On the rare occasions when Mila was present in the same room as Thomas, Logan would catch a glimpse of the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. It wasn't that she was unkind to the boy, at least not in the overt sense. No, it was the little things, the coldness in her voice, the absence of affection, the way she would barely acknowledge Thomas unless she had to. Her treatment of the boy was an echo of her own disappointment, her own unresolved bitterness. And then there were the fights. They were never physical, not yet, anyway, but the verbal blows were sharp and cutting. They would start over something small, something insignificant, but would always devolve into a full-blown argument. Mila would accuse Logan of prioritizing the child over her, of sacrificing their future for someone who wasn't even part of their family. Logan would argue back, trying to explain that it wasn't about a future, it was about doing the right thing. But the more he tried to explain himself, the more Mila withdrew, the walls between them growing higher and more insurmountable with every passing day. The emotional toll of living in a home where love had been replaced by resentment and frustration began to show on Logan as well. His once pristine uniform became wrinkled and worn, his posture slumped with the weight of his personal life. He would wake up in the early hours of the morning, long before the sun rose, to leave for work, avoiding the silence of the house and the constant barrage of complaints from Mila. He spent more time away from home than he had ever imagined, drawn to the security of his duties at the palace, where there was no personal drama, no reminders of his failures as a husband or as a father. But even when he was at the palace, his thoughts often drifted back home, to the boy who needed him, to the growing rift between him and Mila. He couldn't help but wonder if there was something more he could do, something that might bring peace back to their household, but every time he returned home, he was met with the same coldness, the same indifference from Mila. The cycle seemed unbreakable. One particularly heated evening, after a long day of work, Logan returned home to find Mila at her breaking point. She was standing in the kitchen, her back rigid, her hands trembling at her sides. The tension in the air was palpable, thicker than it had ever been before. "You can't keep doing this, Logan," Mila said, her voice sharp, almost breaking. "You can't keep pretending everything is fine. You're not the same person anymore. And neither am I." Logan stood at the doorway, his heart sinking as he saw the hurt in her eyes. The anger, yes, but also something deeper, a pain, a weariness that had built up over the years. It wasn't just the child, it was everything. The years of struggle, the unspoken frustrations, the broken dreams. Logan felt it all too. "I'm trying, Mila," he said, his voice strained. "I'm trying to make this work. For Thomas. For us." Mila shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't get it, do you? You think this is just about Thomas, but it's not. It's about us. And you're so lost in your guilt and your responsibility for him that you're forgetting about the two of us." Logan didn't know how to respond. He could feel the distance between them, a chasm that had grown so wide that no words could bridge it. He wasn't sure what to say anymore. But before he could speak, he heard the soft shuffle of footsteps from the hallway. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his wide eyes glancing between the two of them. His small body looked so fragile in the glow of the kitchen light, his mismatched eyes filled with confusion and fear. He didn't understand the fight between Logan and Mila, but he could feel it. He could always feel it. Logan's heart clenched as he looked at the boy. He walked over to him, crouching down to Thomas's level. "It's okay, buddy," he said, trying to sound reassuring, but his voice wavered. "Everything's going to be okay." Mila stood in the background, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't speak, but the look on her face said everything. Thomas, sensing the tension, walked over to Logan and wrapped his arms around him. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough. Logan held him tight, feeling the weight of the child's trust in him. But even as he held Thomas, he knew the truth. The boy's pain, his fear, his uncertainty, it wasn't going to go away. Not as long as the undercurrent of anger and resentment remained between him and Mila. The road ahead was uncertain, and Logan knew that his choice had not only changed Thomas's life but his own as well. As he stood there, holding the boy close, he realized that the greatest challenge would not be in providing for Thomas, but in healing the wounds that ran deep within his own home. The strain was undeniable. But Logan wasn't ready to give up on his family. Not yet. And not while there was still hope that love could heal the cracks in their lives. But the path forward was anything but clear. The search for identity. As the seasons shifted, so did the rhythms of Logan's life. The days of quiet contentment with Thomas seemed increasingly distant, replaced by the ever-present tension in their home. The small moments of joy, when Thomas would laugh at Logan's jokes or clutch his hand with innocent trust, became more fleeting. The weight of the silence between Logan and Mila hung heavier with every passing day, and Thomas, caught in the crossfire, seemed to retreat into himself more and more. But everything changed the day the news arrived from the palace. Logan had been sitting in the modest kitchen of their home, sipping coffee in the early morning light, when a messenger knocked on the door. The letter in the man's hand was sealed with the royal insignia, its weight heavy with authority. Logan's heart skipped a beat as he accepted the letter, his fingers trembling slightly. When he opened it, his eyes scanned the words quickly. The Queen, it seemed, had fallen gravely ill. Her health had deteriorated rapidly, and her last request, her dying wish, was to find her long-lost son, a boy with one blue eye and one brown. It seemed too surreal to be true. The boy described in the letter matched Thomas to an eerie degree. The mismatched eyes, the pale skin, and the undeniable air of mystery that surrounded his origins. According to the letter, there was a reward, an immense fortune, promised to anyone who could reunite the Queen with her son. At first, Logan couldn't comprehend the significance of the message. He was stunned, feeling as though the very ground beneath him had shifted. The revelation that Thomas might be royalty, a lost prince, was something he hadn't even dared to imagine. But as the details began to sink in, the implications were undeniable. If this was true, it could change everything for Thomas, for their family, and for Logan himself. The world they had known, the struggles, the poverty, the resentment, might all be swept away in an instant. But at what cost? Mila's reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened with greed, her mouth curling into a smile that Logan had not seen before. For the first time since they had taken Thomas in, she seemed to show some form of interest in the boy. It was not the warmth Logan had hoped for, but something darker, something calculating. "It's him," Mila said, her voice trembling with excitement as she read the letter over Logan's shoulder. "You have to see it. This is our chance to finally get out of here. Our ticket to a better life." Logan's mind whirled. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to entertain the idea that Thomas, the child he had promised to love and protect, was merely a means to an end in Mila's eyes. But the evidence was undeniable. The Queen had been searching for her son for years, and now, the possibility that Thomas could be the one they were seeking was within their grasp. For the first time, Logan questioned his place in this new reality. Was Thomas truly the long-lost royal heir, or was this simply a fluke, a strange coincidence that would only bring more hardship into their lives? Regardless of the truth, Mila had made up her mind. She pushed Logan to take Thomas to the palace, to present him as the son the Queen had been searching for. The reward, the fortune promised, was too tempting for her to resist. "You have to do this," Mila insisted, her voice sharp with urgency. "We can't waste this chance. We can't just pretend it's not happening. This is our way out of this miserable existence. You have to go. Now." But Logan hesitated. He couldn't simply send Thomas away without understanding what it meant for the boy. Thomas, in his innocence, had no idea of the gravity of the situation. To him, the Queen's desire to meet him meant nothing but a vague idea of a distant family, a faraway place that seemed to have no relevance in his life. Logan had raised him as his own, and the thought of sending him to the palace, into the world of wealth, power, and political intrigue, was a decision that weighed heavily on his heart. "Mila, wait," Logan said, his voice quiet but firm. You don't understand. This could be a mistake. We don't know what will happen if he goes. We don't know what they'll do to him. He's just a boy. I can't. You're being selfish, Logan, Mila snapped, her frustration seeping into every word. This isn't about you or me. This is about him. Don't you see? He's not our son. He's theirs. He's a prince, Logan. He's the one they've been searching for. And you're going to let him rot in this house? Her words stung, cutting deep into Logan's chest. He had known all along that Mila never truly accepted Thomas as her own. But hearing her say it so plainly, so callously, was like a dagger to his heart. He felt torn between the love he had for the boy he had raised and the harsh reality that Mila was right in one respect. This could be the only chance Thomas would have to reclaim whatever heritage was his. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety, confusion, and internal conflict. Logan couldn't shake the sense of dread that settled over him. It wasn't just the idea of Thomas potentially being thrust into a world of royalty, it was the fear that the boy would be lost to them forever. Despite Logan's reservations, the pull of the royal family's influence was undeniable. The palace's invitation was clear. They wanted Thomas to come, to be presented as their son, the lost heir. And so, reluctantly, Logan agreed. He couldn't deny the reality of the situation. He had to take Thomas to the palace, even if he didn't fully understand what it meant for the boy, for their family, or for himself. The night before they were to leave, Logan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He could hear Thomas's soft breathing from the next room, the boy's presence filling their small home with warmth and life. Thomas was only 15, just on the cusp of adulthood, and yet he was about to be thrust into a world he had never known, a world that could change him in ways Logan feared. Logan had raised Thomas to believe in love, in the importance of family, and in the power of kindness. But in the face of the Queen's demands, how could he explain to Thomas what was happening? How could he prepare him for the storm that was about to engulf them? The following morning, Logan stood at the door with Thomas, ready to leave for the palace. Mila was already waiting by the carriage, her face a mask of determination, as if she were ready to abandon any pretenses of a family for the sake of her own desires. Logan couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he looked at Thomas, who stood beside him, his eyes filled with confusion and uncertainty. "Dad?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice small in the heavy silence of the room. "What's happening? Where are we going?" Logan knelt down in front of him, taking a deep breath. He looked into Thomas's mismatched eyes, the same eyes that had once been so full of innocence, and now seemed clouded with the weight of the world. "We're going to the palace, Thomas," Logan said softly. "The Queen, she's been looking for you. She thinks you're her son." Thomas blinked, the words not fully registering in his young mind. "Her son?" Logan nodded, trying to mask the uncertainty in his own voice. "Yes. It's complicated. But you're special, Thomas. You're important." Thomas's face scrunched up in confusion, but there was something else there, something deeper. It was a look that Logan knew all too well. The boy had already begun to sense that something wasn't right, that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly understand. "Do you think they'll like me there?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Logan swallowed hard, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. He couldn't answer that question, not truthfully. What would they want from Thomas? Love? Respect? Or would they see him as a tool, a means to an end? "I don't know, buddy," Logan said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll be there with you. We'll face it together." As they stepped into the carriage, Logan held Thomas close, his heart heavy with the burden of the unknown. The world outside seemed distant, unreachable, as they traveled toward the palace that would change everything. Thomas's hand rested in his own, his small fingers curling around Logan's. It was a simple gesture, but it was the most important one. And in that moment, Logan knew that no matter what the future held, he would never stop protecting this boy, his son, in every sense that truly mattered. But the journey ahead would test everything they knew about family, loyalty, and the meaning of home. And as they drew closer to the palace, Logan couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into a world that neither of them was truly prepared for. Betrayal and sacrifice. The journey to the palace was long and silent, the rhythmic clattering of the carriage wheels against the cobblestones the only sound filling the air. Logan sat with Thomas, his hand tightly grasping the boy's, the warmth of his touch offering a semblance of comfort amid the uncertainty. Thomas's mismatched eyes, once wide with innocence and curiosity, now appeared clouded with a distant fear. He had no real understanding of what was happening, why they were leaving behind their home, their small, humble life, to step into a world that seemed so far beyond them. Logan watched the boy closely, his heart aching at the thought of what awaited them. He had always known that Thomas was special. But today, standing on the precipice of a future neither of them had ever imagined, Logan realized just how deeply Thomas's life had been intertwined with his own. No matter what they found when they reached the palace, Logan could not abandon him, not now, not ever. Mila, on the other hand, sat at the opposite end of the carriage, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her face as hard as stone. She had barely spoken to Logan since their departure, her excitement over the prospect of wealth and status clouding her emotions. It was as though she had already begun to see Thomas not as a son, but as a tool, a means to elevate herself, to escape the drudgery of their lives. Logan could feel the distance between them growing wider with every passing mile, and it only reinforced his deepest fears. Mila had never truly accepted Thomas, and now, in the face of royal promises and untold riches, her true feelings were more apparent than ever. When they finally arrived at the palace gates, the vastness of the estate struck Logan in a way he had never expected. The towering walls, the gilded architecture, the overwhelming sense of power, it all felt alien to him. As they stepped out of the carriage, Logan could barely contain the tremble in his legs. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, trying to find some familiar footing, some grounding in this foreign world. But there was none. Everything about this place was too grand, too overwhelming. The wealth, the politics, the intricate dance of power that flowed through every corner of the palace, he was an outsider here. A group of palace servants greeted them at the gates, their faces impassive, their movements smooth and practiced. One of them, a tall man dressed in fine robes, approached them with a deep bow. He was courteous, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made Logan uneasy. His demeanor was formal, detached, there was no warmth, no kindness in his greeting. "Welcome to the palace," the servant said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "You are expected. The Queen awaits." Logan nodded, but the words didn't bring any comfort. He glanced down at Thomas, who was standing beside him, his small form trembling slightly. The boy's wide eyes were filled with a mixture of confusion and awe. It was clear he didn't fully understand the significance of this place, but he could sense the gravity of the situation. He looked up at Logan, his voice a soft whisper. "Dad, is this where I'm supposed to be?" Thomas asked, his words breaking through the silence. Logan knelt down, pulling the boy into a tight embrace. His heart ached, torn between the desire to protect Thomas and the weight of the decision that lay ahead. "You're not alone, Thomas," Logan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever happens here, we're in this together. I won't leave you." But in that moment, Logan couldn't help but feel the sharp sting of the truth. The road ahead was uncertain, and the choices they were about to make would change their lives forever. It wasn't just about whether Thomas was the Queen's son, it was about what that revelation would mean for all of them. As they were ushered into the heart of the palace, Logan couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over them. The halls were vast and ornate, with tapestries depicting royal victories and grand celebrations. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and incense, but beneath that, there was something more sinister lurking in the shadows. It was a place where power was bought and sold, where loyalty could be manipulated, and where the truth could be shaped to fit any narrative. They were led down a long corridor, and Logan could feel the eyes of the staff on them. He had spent most of his life in service to the royal family, but this was different. He wasn't just a soldier now, he was a father, standing at the crossroads of a decision that would impact not only Thomas's future but his own. Finally, they arrived at a large chamber, where the queen lay in a massive bed, draped in velvet and silks. Her skin was pale, her frail body barely visible beneath the layers of blankets. The queen's face, once radiant with power, now seemed diminished, a shadow of the regal figure she had once been. Logan's breath caught in his throat as he looked at her. The woman who had sent for Thomas, the one whose dying wish had set all of this into motion, was not the queen he had imagined. She was broken, withered, and the harsh reality of her condition hit him harder than he anticipated. The room was eerily silent as they entered. The queen's attendants stood in the corners, their expressions unreadable. The queen's eyes, though dim, flickered toward them. Her voice was weak but insistent, as though the very act of speaking was a battle she was determined to win. "Is this the boy?" The queen's voice trembled, her gaze fixed on Thomas. Her eyes were wide with hope, but there was something almost desperate in the way she looked at him. Logan nodded, his chest tight with a mixture of anxiety and something else, a deep sense of protectiveness for the boy who had been thrust into this strange world. "Yes," Logan said quietly. "This is Thomas." The queen's face softened slightly, a faint smile pulling at the corners of her lips. But the moment of tenderness was fleeting. Her attendants stepped forward, their movements swift and purposeful. They examined Thomas closely, measuring him with critical eyes, their hands moving over his body with a practiced air of detachment. Logan's pulse quickened. He didn't like the way they were treating the boy, like an object to be evaluated, not a child to be loved. He wanted to say something, to pull Thomas away from their scrutiny, but he knew better than to challenge the authority of the palace staff. As they circled Thomas, one of the attendants, a woman with sharp features and an imperious air, turned to the queen. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice cool and professional, "he matches the description. The boy is likely your son. His eyes, his appearance, it's all consistent with the records." The queen's face lit up at the confirmation, but Logan could see the flicker of something darker behind her eyes, a hunger, a need for power that had been festering for years. She had always wanted a son, an heir to the throne, and now, with Thomas standing before her, that dream could finally be realized. But at what cost? Logan stepped forward, his hand on Thomas's shoulder, feeling the boy's trembling body beneath his fingers. He knew that the queen's desire for a lost heir would not be without consequences. The politics of the palace were never simple. This wasn't just about a family reunion, this was about power, about who would control the future of the kingdom. "What happens now?" Logan asked, his voice steady but filled with apprehension. "What will you do with him?" The queen's eyes flickered to Logan, then back to Thomas. "He will be trained," she said, her voice cold and authoritative. "He will be prepared to take his rightful place as my heir. You," she paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Logan, "will remain here, in service. You may stay with him, if you wish, but understand that your role will be secondary to his. Your loyalty will be tested." Logan's heart sank. This was not the reunion he had hoped for. This was not a simple matter of love or family. This was a transaction. The queen was taking Thomas, and Logan was being relegated to the background, no more than a loyal servant to the royal family. But what could he do? He had promised to protect Thomas, and that promise still stood. No matter the cost. As the attendants began to move Thomas toward the queen, Logan's grip on the boy tightened. "Wait," he said, his voice rising. "You can't just take him. He's not a pawn in your game. The Queen's eyes flashed with irritation, but she didn't respond. The attendants continued their work, ignoring Logan's protests. In that moment, Logan realized the painful truth. He had brought Thomas into a world where he was not loved, but exploited. The palace had no place for the boy's innocence. They saw him only as a vessel for their own ambitions. Logan's heart broke, but he knew what he had to do. He couldn't let them take Thomas without a fight. If the palace wanted to use his son as a tool for power, then Logan would fight to the end to protect him. But as the servants closed in, Logan felt a sharp sense of betrayal. His sacrifice, his decision to bring Thomas here, had led them into this world of cold politics and manipulation. And now, he would have to face the consequences of his choices. The battle had only just begun, and Logan knew that he would never back down. Not for the throne, not for wealth, only for Thomas, the boy he had come to love as his own. Unraveling truths. The days following their arrival at the palace unfolded in a haze of confusion, resentment, and underlying tension. Logan was keenly aware of the shifting dynamics, how quickly his role had changed from protector to mere servant, standing in the shadow of those with titles far grander than his own. His every movement felt scrutinized, every decision weighed with implications he had not anticipated. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed to adapt with a quiet resilience, but it was clear that the gravity of his new identity, the prince he had never asked to be, was weighing heavily on him. The Queen's attendants, sharp-eyed and calculating, began to prepare Thomas for what they called his rightful place. They took him away from Logan more frequently, whisking him off to study royal history, etiquette, language, and the finer points of governance. They were training him, molding him into something he had never been and, in many ways, never wanted to be. And Logan could see it, the sparkle of wonder in Thomas's eyes had slowly dulled, replaced by something darker, more uncertain. Logan, for all his love and commitment to the boy, was quickly sidelined. The palace's power structures were clearly defined, those who were of value, those with noble blood, were given privileges, while others, no matter their service or loyalty, were relegated to the periphery. As a commoner, Logan had been expected to simply obey, to fade into the background and never question the authority of those who held real power. But Logan couldn't shake the feeling that the more Thomas embraced his royal identity, the further he was from the child Logan had once saved. Every night, when the palace grew quiet and the lights dimmed in the grand hallways, Logan would wander to the small room where Thomas was kept. It wasn't the same room they had shared when they first arrived, before Thomas's training had begun. Now, it was a larger, more ornate space, a room befitting a prince. The walls were adorned with tapestries of royal ancestors, the floors covered in fine rugs, and the windows framed by gold drapes that shimmered in the dim light. But despite the opulence, it felt wrong, cold, sterile, and impersonal. Each time Logan entered the room, he was met with the same distant look from Thomas. The boy was no longer the bright-eyed child Logan had rescued from the streets. He had been transformed into something else, a shadow of the prince the Queen had hoped for, but no longer the son Logan had loved as his own. "You're so different now," Logan said one evening, his voice soft but heavy with the weight of the truth. He had come to realize that Thomas was no longer the same person. The palace had done something to him. Thomas, who had been gazing out the window, his back to Logan, turned slowly. His mismatched eyes, once full of curiosity and warmth, now seemed clouded with a quiet resignation. "I'm not different," Thomas replied quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "This is who I was always meant to be. It's what they want. It's who I have to be." His words were calm, but there was an edge to them, a bitterness that Logan hadn't heard before. Logan felt a pang in his chest. He knew the boy was just a child, struggling to make sense of the world around him, but this transformation, this acceptance of his new identity, struck Logan like a blow. He had hoped, so deeply, that Thomas could remain unaffected by the royal politics, that he could stay true to the boy he had rescued. But the palace, with its endless promises of power and legacy, had begun to chip away at the very essence of the boy Logan had once known. "No," Logan said, his voice firm, as he stepped closer to Thomas. "You don't have to be that. You don't have to be what they want. You're still my son, Thomas. You're still the boy I saved from the streets. No one can take that away from you, not them, not the palace, no one." Thomas's gaze shifted to meet Logan's. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps doubt, perhaps confusion, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He turned back toward the window, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't have a choice," he whispered. "I have to do this. They won't let me go." Logan clenched his fists at his sides. The hopelessness in Thomas's voice echoed in his own heart. It was true. The more Thomas assimilated into royal life, the less he seemed to belong in Logan's world. The weight of his royal blood was now something that could not be ignored, and the palace would never let him forget it. But Logan refused to accept this. He had promised to protect Thomas, and he wasn't about to let the boy slip away from him, no matter the cost. Logan's love for Thomas had always been rooted in something deeper than mere survival or circumstance. It was something pure, something that had transcended blood and duty. He wasn't about to lose that. The next few days were filled with a growing tension, as Logan became more and more aware of the palace's true intentions. The Queen, although weak in body, still had the power to control everything. Her advisors and attendants were relentless in their pursuit of power. They saw Thomas not as a child, but as a pawn, a tool to solidify their hold on the throne. Logan was just a reminder of the boy's origins, his connection to the commoners that the royal family had long distanced themselves from. And it was in these quiet moments, when the palace seemed to whisper its darker truths to him, that Logan began to feel the sting of betrayal, not just from the Queen, but from the system she had upheld for so many years. Logan had given up his life, his job, and his dignity for Thomas, but the kingdom didn't care. It was using Thomas, using him for its own gain. The child Logan had once saved from the brink of death was now being shaped into something he had never asked to be. Logan knew he couldn't let this go on any longer. He could no longer stand idly by, watching as Thomas's essence was drained by the very people who claimed to be his family. If Thomas was going to survive in this world, if he was going to ever be free of the shackles of royalty, then Logan would have to take matters into his own hands. It wasn't long before Logan made his decision. He had learned enough of the palace's ways, enough of the Queen's intentions, to know that they would never let Thomas go. They would use him as long as they could. But Logan wasn't going to let that happen. He would find a way to get Thomas out. Late one night, after everyone had retired to their chambers, Logan quietly approached the room where Thomas was kept. He had arranged for a way out, an escape. He knew the risks. He knew the consequences of defying the palace, but he also knew the stakes. The life Thomas had known, the life Logan had given him, was slipping away. And unless they acted now, it would be gone forever. Thomas was sitting on the edge of his bed when Logan entered. His eyes widened with surprise, but there was no question in them. He had sensed it, the change, the shift. Logan had come to rescue him. "Thomas," Logan whispered, his voice urgent. "We're leaving. Tonight." The boy stood, his face a mixture of disbelief and something else, hope. Logan saw it there, flickering behind the confusion, and it gave him the strength to continue. "I don't want to be part of this anymore," Thomas said, his voice shaky but resolute. "I never asked for this. I just want to be me again." Logan nodded, stepping forward and taking Thomas's hand in his. "We'll make it happen," he said softly. "We'll leave this place and go where no one can find us. Where you can be free. I promise." The two of them moved quickly, quietly through the palace halls, avoiding guards and staff as best they could. The plan was risky, but it was the only one they had. They had no time to waste. Every minute they spent in the palace was another minute closer to being trapped in its web of lies and control. As they neared the back exit, Logan's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the faint sounds of footsteps approaching, but he pressed on, pulling Thomas close. There was no turning back now. They reached the exit and slipped into the cool night air, the vast palace looming behind them. Logan could feel the weight of what they had just done, the enormity of the decision they had made. But as he looked at Thomas, his heart filled with something stronger than fear, hope. For the first time in months, Logan felt like he was doing the right thing. He was giving Thomas the chance to live, to be who he truly was, free from the chains of royalty, free from the expectations that had been thrust upon him. The road ahead was uncertain, and the world outside the palace walls was a dangerous one. But Logan knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. And together, they would find their way to a future where they could both be free. They had made the first step toward their new life. There was no turning back. A son's return. The night air was crisp as Logan and Thomas moved swiftly through the shadowed streets of the palace grounds. The vast walls of the royal estate loomed behind them, and though they had managed to escape without immediate pursuit, the feeling of danger was ever present. Every footstep felt heavy, as if the weight of the decisions they had made was pressing down on them. Logan's heart pounded in his chest, but the resolve in his eyes never wavered. He had chosen this path, and with it, he had chosen freedom for both himself and Thomas. The streets outside the palace were quiet, the usual hum of royal life fading into the distance. Logan pulled Thomas close to him, his grip firm but gentle. The boy, still young and filled with confusion, had been thrust into a whirlwind of events he didn't fully understand. He had been a child forced into a role he never asked for, and now he was free, but at what cost? "Where will we go now?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet, betraying the uncertainty he felt. He was still processing everything that had happened in the last few hours, the realization that he had just left behind a life of unimaginable wealth, power, and expectations. Logan glanced down at the boy, his mismatched eyes gleaming with a mixture of hope and fear. "We'll go to the outskirts of the city. It's not much, but we can start fresh. We'll find a place where you can just be you." Thomas nodded, but Logan could see the struggle in his eyes. For all the years Thomas had spent as a child in the palace, he had never truly known a life outside of it. The idea of freedom, of living without the shadow of royalty looming over him, was both exhilarating and terrifying. As they walked further from the palace, Logan felt the weight of their situation sink deeper into his bones. The world outside was vast and unpredictable. They had no money, no plan, and no idea how they would survive. But Logan didn't care. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of a future not defined by the chains of the past. The following weeks were a blur of hard work, desperation, and small victories. Logan and Thomas found a humble little cabin on the edge of the city, hidden away from the prying eyes of the palace. It was far from the grand estate they had left behind, but it was theirs, a place they could call their own. The simple wooden structure, with its rough-hewn floors and thatched roof, provided shelter from the elements. It was a modest home, but it was a beginning. Logan took up whatever work he could find, manual labor, odd jobs for local merchants, anything that would bring in enough money to put food on the table. It was hard, exhausting work, but Logan didn't mind. Every long day spent in the fields or at construction sites was a reminder of the life he had chosen, a life of self-sufficiency, away from the manipulative grip of the royal family. And Thomas? He worked beside him, learning the value of sweat and labor, just as Logan had once done. For a time, the life they built together was peaceful, but it was never without challenges. The loss of wealth, status, and the luxury they had once known was not something they could simply forget. Thomas, in particular, struggled with the idea of being just another boy in the world. He had once known the promise of riches, of a future filled with unimaginable power. Now, he was like every other child, bound to the harsh realities of survival. Thomas's guilt was often evident in the quiet moments when he would look at their tiny cabin and sigh, or when he would catch Logan's eye and apologize for the difficulty they faced. He still carried the weight of being royalty, the sense of responsibility that had been drummed into him from birth. But Logan, despite the weight of his own burdens, refused to let Thomas carry this weight alone. "You're not responsible for anything," Logan would tell him. "You never asked for this. You're a child, and you deserve to be happy, no matter what." But the royal blood in Thomas's veins, his mismatched eyes, his lineage, never truly left him. It was a part of who he was, and try as he might to escape it, he couldn't ignore the sense of responsibility that had been forced upon him. It was as if the ghost of the palace still haunted him, hovering just out of reach, pulling him back into a world he no longer wanted to be part of. One evening, as they sat together in the cabin, eating the simple meal Logan had managed to put together, Thomas finally spoke the words that had been building inside him. "Dad, do you think I'm wrong for leaving?" His voice was small, uncertain. "Do you think I could have made a difference? I mean, maybe I could have helped the Queen. Maybe I could have done something good with all that power." Logan paused, looking at his son with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He had known this day would come. The questioning, the self-doubt, the desire to find meaning in the life that had been thrust upon him. Logan set his bowl down, his eyes never leaving Thomas. "Son," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "What you do with your life is up to you. You don't owe the Queen anything, and you certainly don't owe anyone a life that doesn't make you happy. You were a child, Thomas. You were forced into a world that wasn't yours. And you made the right choice, coming here, with me." Thomas looked at his father, his eyes searching Logan's face for some sort of affirmation, some sign that he hadn't made a mistake. But Logan's gaze was unwavering. "You're not just the Queen's son, Thomas," Logan continued. "You're my son. And that's what matters. We'll make our own future, and it won't be defined by the palace or the past. We'll create something new." For the first time in weeks, Thomas's expression softened. The sadness that had clung to him like a second skin seemed to lift, just a little. It was as if Logan's words had pierced the wall Thomas had built around himself. He nodded, though the doubts didn't disappear entirely. It would take time for him to fully understand the magnitude of his choices, and perhaps even longer to let go of the identity he had carried for so long. Months passed, and Logan and Thomas continued to carve out their new life. The village they had settled in was quiet, far removed from the bustling palace, but it offered them a semblance of peace. They were accepted by the locals, who appreciated Logan's hard work and quiet demeanor. Slowly but surely, they found themselves blending into the community, their presence no longer something out of place but simply another part of the fabric of village life. But even as they settled into their new existence, Logan knew that their escape from the palace wasn't as permanent as they would have liked. The royal family, once aware of Thomas's existence and his potential claim to the throne, would not forget about him so easily. Logan's every instinct told him that the palace would eventually come searching for Thomas, would eventually demand his return. Logan did everything in his power to keep their past hidden. They changed their names, kept to themselves, and avoided attracting attention. But Thomas, despite his desire for a fresh start, would occasionally look at the horizon with a longing in his eyes. He had left behind everything, his birthright, his family, his future, and now, there were moments when he questioned the life they had chosen. Would he ever truly be free of the past? Would he ever escape the shadow of the palace? And yet, despite the uncertainties that loomed on the horizon, Logan felt a quiet strength building within him. The life they had created, humble and simple though it was, had been born of love and sacrifice. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And as long as they had each other, Logan was certain they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. One evening, as they sat outside their cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Thomas turned to Logan. Do you think the Queen ever regrets what she did?" Thomas asked, his voice low, as if the question weighed heavy on his heart. Logan looked at him, his gaze thoughtful. "I think the Queen, like anyone, is driven by her desires. But in the end, she doesn't understand the value of what she had. Not the way we do. We've learned something she never will, what it means to truly love, to care for someone beyond what they can give you. And that's what matters." Thomas nodded, a quiet peace settling over him. For the first time, he seemed to understand that the true value of life wasn't in titles or power. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about love, and the strength of the bond between father and son. As the stars began to twinkle above them, Logan felt a sense of contentment wash over him. They were no longer running from the past. They were building a future of their own, and for the first time in years, Logan knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together. Free. And finally, at peace.